July 25, 2024. A private twin-engine plane touches down on a scorching runway in El Paso, Texas. Federal agents storm the cabin with weapons drawn, expecting a massive firefight. Instead, they find a 76-year-old man. He is zip-tied, sedated, and barely conscious. The most wanted drug lord on the planet did not surrender to authorities. He was delivered like a parcel. This is Ismael El Mayo Zambada, the co-founder and ultimate mastermind of the Sinaloa Cartel. For exactly half a century, he evaded the DEA, the FBI, the CIA, and the combined forces of the Mexican military. He never spent a single day in custody. His partners got captured. His rivals got slaughtered. But El Mayo just kept winning from the shadows. But here is the paradox that breaks every rule of the underworld. The man who orchestrated this capture was not a seasoned federal agent or a rival kingpin seeking blood. It was his own godson, Joaquin Guzman Lopez, the son of his closest ally, El Chapo. A kid that Mayo bounced on his knee, taught the brutal rules of the business, and protected like his own flesh and blood. When Joaquin called about a routine family matter regarding real estate, Mayo climbed aboard without a single second thought. He woke up in American handcuffs. The son of his oldest compadre just traded a 76-year-old godfather for his own freedom. 50 years of absolute survival, billions of dollars moved across borders, entire governments bribed and corrupted. All of it was undone by a familiar face and a glass of heavily drugged tequila. How did the untouchable ghost miss the one threat he never prepared for? And what exactly made his godson willing to betray his own blood to the enemy? This is not just a story of a cartel betrayal. This is the bloodiest butterfly effect of the 21st century. The empire built in the shadows was about to be dragged into the blinding light by a generation of reckless heirs. In January 2017, Joaquin El Chapo Guzman faced a United States judge for the final time. He was extradited in chains and locked away in the most secure facility on earth. El Mayo was suddenly standing completely alone at the top of the Sinaloa pyramid. The flashy half of their 40-year alliance vanished forever into a concrete box. But waiting eagerly in the wings were El Chapo's sons. They were known collectively as Los Chapitos. The four Guzman brothers, Ivan, Jesus, Alfredo, Ovidio, and Joaquin Jr., immediately announced themselves as the rightful heirs. They were young, entitled, and incredibly dangerous. At first, the old-school cartel bosses sneered at them. These were narco princelings, who spent more time posting pictures of their pet tigers and gold rifles. They enthusiastically embraced every single flashy excess that El Mayo had spent a lifetime diligently avoiding. Up in the remote mountains of Sinaloa, the seasoned capos rolled their eyes in disgust. El Mayo, now in his 70s, watched the transition with a mixture of deep contempt and dread. These arrogant juniors inherited a $500 million empire, and they treated it like a game. But Los Chapitos were not merely spoiled rich kids. They were ruthlessly ambitious. The arrest of their father had made them immediate targets for rival cartels and government forces. So they actively escalated the one specific business that El Mayo deeply feared: fentanyl. The ambitious brothers dove headlong into the massive manufacturing of the cheap, deadly synthetic opioid. It was a product that was actively killing tens of thousands of Americans every single year. Fentanyl brought in unimaginable mountains of cash, but it also brought down an unprecedented level of political heat. By 2019, top United States officials publicly branded Los Chapitos as the primary face of America's deadliest drug crisis. Washington's response was historically ferocious. Federal indictments rained down from the sky. The DEA dramatically raised the bounties on the brothers to $10 million each. Practically overnight, these young, entitled heirs sat at the very top of America's most wanted list. El Mayo instantly recognized the terrifying pattern. This reckless behavior was exactly what he had meticulously avoided his entire criminal career. High-profile operations that generated massive body counts always made you priority number one for the American government. The Chapitos, in his experienced view, were blindly steering the entire Sinaloa cartel directly toward a Category 5 hurricane. Their staggering recklessness actively endangered everyone in the organization. Deep tensions between Los Mayos, which was El Mayo's loyal faction, and Los Chapitos festered dangerously beneath the surface. They still technically co-led the mega cartel on paper, but deep paranoia and distrust seeped into every single interaction. The young guns, arrogant and flush with fentanyl cash, genuinely felt that El Mayo was trapped in outdated thinking. The old man firmly believed that these stupid kids would inevitably get them all killed or captured by the Americans. The sprawling empire that once ran like a perfectly oiled machine now sputtered violently with two entirely competing engines. Then, the hidden cracks exploded violently into the open. On October 17, 2019, Mexican security forces moved swiftly to arrest Ovidio Guzman at his Culiacan safe house. For a brief moment, it looked like a major victory for the government, but within minutes, absolute hell erupted on the streets. Hundreds of heavily armed cartel gunmen aggressively stormed the city. They completely blockaded major intersections with burning commercial vehicles. They violently sprang prisoners from local jails to bolster their ranks. They unleashed 50-caliber machine guns and rocket-propelled grenades, transforming a peaceful Thursday afternoon into a terrifying zone of urban warfare. Terrified civilians fled for their lives as massive convoys of sicarios raced wildly through residential neighborhoods. Thick black smoke rose menacingly over the city skyline. The Mexican government completely blinked. Cartel operatives ruthlessly seized the families of soldiers as hostages and effectively put a loaded gun to the head of the entire city. They released a chilling video demanding Ovidio's release, or they would burn Culiacan to ash. In an unprecedented move of capitulation, the president ordered the military to stand down. By nightfall, Ovidio walked out a free man. Los Chapitos wildly celebrated their chaotic victory. They had successfully forced a sovereign nation-state to its absolute knees in under 8 hours. For El Mayo, this was a living nightmare made totally real. The Chapitos had just painted a gigantic glowing target on the back of the entire Sinaloa Cartel. The whole world just witnessed their terrifying military firepower, and it was far too effective for the Americans to simply ignore. Sure enough, the outrage in Washington intensified exponentially. One former DEA official observed grimly that the fentanyl brought them down. The massive civilian death toll from the Chapitos' operations kept the United States government laser-focused on completely destroying the cartel. After the disaster in Culiacan, eliminating Los Chapitos became an urgent top-tier priority for both governments. On January 5, 2023, Mexican Special Forces launched a massive second raid for Ovidio. They sent 3,500 elite troops and Black Hawk gunships with absolutely no intention of backing down this time. Another brutal firefight rocked the state of Sinaloa, but this time the government held the line. They captured Ovidio and rapidly extracted him before the cartel could properly regroup its forces. By September 2023, he was sitting helplessly in a freezing United States jail cell facing life behind bars. For Joaquin Guzman Lopez, who was Ovidio's quiet younger brother, the writing on the wall glowed neon red. The Americans would absolutely never stop hunting them. The harder Los Chapitos violently fought back, the harder the inevitable government crackdown became. His older brothers, Ivan and Alfredo, still lived large, and still arrogantly believed they could easily outgun or outspend the massive problem. But Joaquin had silently inherited some of his father's cunning, and perhaps some of El Mayo's cold pragmatism. He began to quietly accept a very bleak truth. The drug game was now completely unwinnable by the old traditional rules. Every single path forward operating under the current strategy led directly to a violent death or a supermax prison cell. He desperately needed a third option. He searched for a move so incredibly unconventional that it would completely upend the chessboard and save his own skin. What move could possibly change the entire equation for him? What ultimate card did Joaquin quietly hold that absolutely no one expected him to play? The answer lay in the one man who had survived everything, Ismael Zambada himself. Delivering El Mayo alive to the United States authorities would be the ultimate prize. It would be exactly like handing them Osama bin Laden on a silver platter wrapped in a bow. Joaquin recognized his primary rival, and former godfather was the key to his own salvation. If Joaquin could be the one to orchestrate that capture, several massive shifts would happen simultaneously. His primary rival faction, Los Mayos, would instantly be rendered leaderless and totally vulnerable. The Chapitos could potentially absorb their massive territory or completely neutralize their threat. More importantly, Joaquin would gain unimaginable leverage with the American prosecutors. It would be enough leverage to potentially negotiate a sweetheart plea deal for himself, possibly leniency for his brother Ovidio, and perhaps eventually his total freedom. By officially surrendering to the United States, he would also immediately remove his name from the assassination target list of rival cartels in Mexico. A high-security U.S. prison cell might incredibly actually be a far safer place for him to exist than the violently boiling cauldron of Sinaloa. It was a staggering cold calculation based on ruthless, unfeeling logic. But from Joaquin's increasingly desperate position, loyalty to a 76-year-old kingpin was a luxury he could absolutely no longer afford to entertain. The world had dealt him a spectacularly losing hand. So he actively decided to violently reshuffle the deck entirely. The first crucial step was to quietly contact the Americans. Through a complex network of intermediaries, likely high-priced defense lawyers, Joaquin cautiously signaled to the government that he was actually willing to talk business. At first, the seasoned agents were understandably skeptical. They had heard many empty surrender offers before, that usually fizzled out completely. But then came the absolute bombshell that shocked Washington. Joaquin explicitly offered to personally deliver Ismael El Mayo Zambada as a package deal. One astounded U.S. official, later privately called El Mayo, the absolute cherry on top of the entire surrender negotiation. It was a twist that the intelligence community never expected at all. The eager Americans aggressively bit at the bait. Months of highly secretive back-channel negotiations silently followed. The rough, overarching terms slowly emerged. Joaquin officially surrenders himself and safely delivers El Mayo on a pristine silver platter to the United States. In direct return, he strongly expects radically reduced criminal charges, absolutely no life sentence, and possibly entry into the Federal Witness Protection Program after serving time. But the absolute hardest part of this insane plan fundamentally remained. How on earth does a young Chapo get Ismael Zambada to completely drop his paranoid guard? This was a man who famously trusted practically no one on the entire planet. But Joaquin strategically sat tightly inside that incredibly exclusive inner circle. He was practically blood family. He was El Mayo's godson and a lifelong friend of his father since the 1980s. If any single person alive could effectively lure El Mayo out into the open, vulnerable, and unescorted, it was definitively a Guzman's son. Joaquin meticulously crafted the deadly bait. He casually reached out through completely secure channels with a deeply friendly and mundane request. A simple business proposal regarding a potential real estate investment that needed a quick resolution, something entirely routine for cartel billionaires. He politely suggested meeting entirely face-to-face with absolutely no digital devices, exactly how the deeply cautious El Mayo preferred to operate. For El Mayo, there was very little initial reason to automatically refuse the invitation. He had intimately known Joaquin since the kid was literally in diapers. This was his oldest compadre's son, practically his own flesh and blood. Besides, El Mayo had been actively trying for months to politically stabilize the fractured cartel after Ovidio's disastrous capture. Perhaps Joaquin genuinely wanted some sage guidance or crucial strategy from the old master. So incredibly, El Mayo readily agreed to the fateful meeting. In late July 2024, they selected a completely nondescript house, sitting quietly on the dusty outskirts of Culiacan. It featured minimal visible security and an incredibly low profile by design. The single most paranoid and elusive criminal on planet Earth willingly walked wide-eyed straight into a perfectly laid trap, because even his legendary paranoia had one glaring blind spot: total trust in family. What exactly transpired inside that sweltering, unassuming house? And how does a 76-year-old mythical legend suddenly end up violently zip-tied, heavily drugged, and strapped down on a tiny private plane, hurtling toward the terrifying reality of America? July 25th, 2024, Culiacan, Sinaloa. A brutally sweltering afternoon, heavily settled on the dusty edge of the sprawling city. The highly anticipated meeting spot was a simple one-story ranch house with tragically peeling paint sitting totally isolated on an empty dirt lot. By careful design, the location looked completely abandoned from the outside. Inside, on a small table, simple fruit and bottled water calmly sat as if prepared for a very cordial and completely unthreatening business chat. But hiding silently in the dim adjoining room, 6 heavily armed men, dressed in dark military-style fatigues, waited with their breath held. They were specifically handpicked by Joaquin Guzman Lopez himself. They were given one very clear, absolute directive. Do not under any circumstance let Ismael Zambada leave this property alive and free. Joaquin anxiously arrived, first heavily accompanied by a small few of his most loyal and capable gunmen. He nervously paced the small living room, repeatedly glancing at his expensive watch. Massive adrenaline fiercely coursed through his veins as he mentally rehearsed the incredibly dangerous plan, one final excruciating time. American federal agents eagerly waited right across the Texas border, fully prepped to formally receive an incredibly valuable package. The hired pilot stood nervously ready at the private airstrip. Everything in Joaquin's entire existence completely came down to the deeply terrifying next few minutes. It was undeniably the absolute most dangerous moment of his entire life. If El Mayo even slightly sensed the impending betrayal, thousands of bullets would immediately fly, and this small concrete house would instantly become a mass coffin for everyone inside. Thick dust kicked up dramatically outside the window. The small convoy slowly approached. El Mayo, True to his legendary caution, almost never traveled in a massive, flashy entourage that would draw attention. Two completely plain SUVs rolled up incredibly quietly to the front door. Highly trained bodyguards practically hopped out first. They rapidly scanned the entire surrounding area with their tense hands firmly on their automatic rifles. Seeing absolutely nothing seemingly amiss, they confidently nodded the all-clear signal. El Mayo slowly emerged from the armored second vehicle. A 76-year-old man with bright white hair and a deeply weathered, tired face. He calmly adjusted his signature hat and slowly walked deliberately toward the waiting front door, remaining typically cautious but entirely unafraid. To him, this was quite simply just another deeply discreet cartel business meeting among true family. Inside the sweltering room, Joaquin loudly greeted him incredibly warmly. There was a firm handshake and a deep familiar embrace. If El Mayo ever had any fleeting doubts, they completely melted away in that very moment of familial connection. He looked incredibly genuinely relieved to finally focus on important business matters with someone he explicitly trusted. Casual small talk quickly ensued to lower the temperature. They briefly discussed family matters, absent friends, and the absolute latest wild rumors circulating through the cartel. It was an almost boringly normal narco conversation. Then, Joaquin expertly steered the incredibly tense conversation toward the actual objective. "Let me show you something incredibly important in the other room," he said casually. "The property blueprints are waiting for us." He confidently stood up and simply motioned toward a dimly lit adjoining doorway. El Mayo did not hesitate for a single second. This was his own godson after all, leading the way. He slowly rose to his feet and confidently walked in first. Total absolute chaos instantly ignited in the dark. 6 heavily armed men violently burst from the deep shadows and aggressively slammed the 76-year-old legend face first to the hard ground. A heavy knee brutally pressed deep into his spine while his fragile arms were violently wrenched up behind him. Thick plastic zip ties rapidly cinched his frail wrists completely tight. Another brutal tie instantly bound his kicking legs together. A heavy black hood was aggressively yanked down over his bleeding head. Outside the house, his loyal bodyguards desperately heard the sudden commotion and immediately rushed for the locked front door. Suppressed automatic gunfire instantly dropped them dead in the dusty doorway. The shocking ambush was completely total and absolute. El Mayo, the legendary uncatchable mastermind, now lay helplessly hog-tied on a dirty concrete floor, violently gasping for air through the thick fabric bag. Through the terrifying darkness, he could clearly hear Joaquin's voice remaining chillingly calm and commanding, giving rapid orders to his men. This was absolutely not a frantic government raid. This was a cold, calculated betrayal from deep inside his own trusted guard. They callously hauled him roughly up, exactly like heavy cargo. At 76 years old, he was absolutely no match for multiple trained killers in their physical prime. 2 men aggressively grabbed his tied arms. A strong third man easily carried his firmly bound legs. They desperately rushed him out the back door, shoved him violently into a waiting pickup truck bed, and quickly covered his struggling body with a thick, heavy tarp. Joaquin confidently hopped into the driver's cabin. The small convoy instantly peeled out, leaving a massive cloud of dust behind. The entire snatch operation had taken exactly 90 terrifying seconds. The speeding truck raced frantically toward a hidden private airstrip located just outside the city limits. A small twin-engine Beechcraft King Air airplane sat fully ready on the hot tarmac with its engines already roaring. There was absolutely no formal flight plan filed. It was a completely illegal, desperate flight, straight across the highly secured United States border, relying entirely on a dangerously low-altitude flight path and incredibly blind luck. They violently bundled the struggling El Mayo rapidly up the narrow plane steps, and tightly strapped his bound body firmly to a leather seat. He thrashed wildly through the thick, dark hood, but a very heavy hand aggressively pinned his shoulders down. Someone quickly produced a spiked drink, heavily laced with a very fast-acting and powerful sedative. Joaquin coldly coaxed his struggling godfather. "Take a small sip of this. You will definitely feel much better." El Mayo reluctantly swallowed the bitter liquid. Within mere minutes, his heavy head completely drooped forward into deep unconsciousness. The small King Air rapidly lifted off the runway, skimming dangerously low over the rugged Sierra Madre Mountains. Aggressively crossing the invisible international line, high-ranking United States authorities had already been explicitly tipped off. The incredibly valuable package was confirmed to be actively in the air. Highly trained FBI and fully armed Homeland Security agents frantically scrambled in massive, heavily armed convoys to the small Santa Teresa airport, located just directly outside of El Paso, Texas. They barely arrived directly on the tarmac in time. One bewildered local airport worker later vividly recalled silently watching the small, unidentified plane rapidly descend. Out of the clear blue sky that blazing hot Thursday afternoon, dozens of heavily armed federal agents were already anxiously waiting directly on the blistering hot runway. The plane's tires screeched loudly on the baking tarmac. Armed agents immediately swarmed the entire aircraft with absolute overwhelming force. Joaquin slowly appeared at the very top of the small plane steps, with his hands held high, clearly surrendering completely voluntarily to the screaming agents. Heavily armed agents violently rushed inside the dark cabin and excitedly found the heavily guarded second passenger. He was deeply slumped over and completely woozy. The ultimate white whale of the entire DEA was finally safely delivered, perfectly gift-wrapped to the United States. They aggressively dragged El Mayo roughly off the plane directly into heavy steel cuffs. The shocking breaking news furiously flashed across the entire globe within a few short hours. The completely impossible had incredibly actually occurred. Ismael El Mayo Zambada was finally at long last sitting in United States federal custody. The legend who outsmarted everyone for 50 years was completely undone by a very simple lie about local real estate. But as El Mayo slowly awoke in a sterile, freezing cold FBI holding cell, with the heavy sedatives finally wearing off, Joaquin sat completely alone in a totally separate cell, perhaps already intensely feeling the crushing weight of exactly what he had just violently unleashed. Joaquin had successfully pulled off the absolute coup of a lifetime, but he was now unequivocally a heavily marked man in the terrifying eyes of every single hardened loyalist back home in Mexico. What exactly violently happens when a multi-billion-dollar cartel suddenly loses its entirely untouchable quiet king? And exactly what terrifying bloody price does the ultimate traitor eventually pay for his freedom? When a king is violently overthrown, his loyal subjects do not peacefully organize a funeral. They violently tear each other apart to frantically claim the empty throne. The morning after, the shocking news officially broke an incredibly thick tension, completely blanketed Culiacan like a suffocating fog. Everyone across the entire country quickly heard the unbelievable headlines. El Mayo was officially captured. He was brutally betrayed by El Chapo's quietest son. In countless safe houses and remote ranches spread across Sinaloa, heavily armed sicarios nervously checked their assault rifles. Cartel bosses frantically made incredibly hushed phone calls in the dark. The absolutely unthinkable had finally occurred. In Washington, top government officials were visibly giddy with massive excitement. President Biden publicly hailed the dramatic arrest as a massive historic victory against the ruthless fentanyl traffickers. Triumphant press releases endlessly boasted about the relentless, dedicated work of federal agents. But down in Mexico City, the national government was completely blindsided and absolutely furious. Mexico's president bitterly complained that the United States illegally carried out this massive kidnapping operation directly on their sovereign soil without any prior warning. It was a massive sovereign humiliation. Panicking, Mexican officials desperately scrambled to the cameras, actively insisting they were absolutely not involved in any capacity. They even bizarrely suggested that El Mayo might have actually surrendered completely voluntarily. They would say absolutely anything to desperately deflect from the terrifying reality. A Guzman son successfully abducted a legendary drug lord and illegally flew him out right under the government's collective noses. It was a diplomatic disaster of epic proportions, but the far more explosive reaction violently erupted deeply within the massive cartel itself. El Mayo's fiercely loyal faction known as Los Mayos began to absolutely seethe with an uncontrollable, terrifying rage. Their beloved patriarch, the man they proudly guarded for decades, was violently kidnapped and cowardly handed to the Americans by someone they closely regarded as actual family. It was the deepest possible betrayal in the criminal underworld. On the opposing side, the remaining Chapitos, specifically Ivan and Alfredo, suddenly faced an incredibly desperate and terrifying situation. Their own flesh and blood brother just violently broke the absolute cardinal rule of the entire cartel. How could any other traffickers ever possibly trust them now? To desperately prove their absolute loyalty, Ivan and Alfredo shockingly and publicly denounced Joaquin. Word quickly spread that they officially placed a massive bounty directly on his head. Betrayal must always be paid in blood, regardless of the Guzman name. On September 9, 2024, right before dawn, massive gunfire suddenly erupted across multiple crowded Culiacan neighborhoods. It was Los Mayos violently clashing directly against Los Chapitos. The residential streets instantly became terrifying war zones. Massive convoys of heavily armored pickup trucks equipped with mounted machine guns roared violently through the districts. They heavily traded automatic fire in broad daylight. Hidden safe houses were aggressively assaulted. Mangled bodies quickly turned up on dirt roadsides, some brutally decapitated as horrific warnings. Dozens of young men died in the very first bloody days. Many more entirely vanished, violently kidnapped by rival hit squads in the dead of night. The Mexican military desperately flooded the state with thousands of heavily armed troops, but they completely struggled to safely contain the extreme violence. Local schools immediately shut down. Small businesses locked their doors. Terrified residents huddled in their dark homes as heavy gunfire violently chattered through the entire night. Over the incredibly violent following year, this brutal internal conflict predictably claimed thousands of innocent and guilty lives alike. The massive cartel, once globally famed for its unprecedented cohesion, began to violently tear itself completely apart. The empire that diligently took 50 years to build completely collapsed in mere months. The Sinaloa Cartel fully fractured into heavily warring factions. External ruthless enemies eagerly seized valuable territory amid the massive internal chaos. It is definitively the largest violent upheaval in Mexico's dark underworld in decades, and it all tragically traces back to that one single meeting in July. One single act of treachery instantly triggered an unstoppable chain reaction of mass destruction. Ismael El Mayo Zambada currently finds himself sitting in a freezing United States federal courtroom, facing the rest of his life. In August 2025, facing the absolute certainty of dying completely alone behind thick steel bars, El Mayo finally pleads guilty. At 77 years old, he slowly tells a powerful judge about the incredibly dark life he ruthlessly led since the 1960s. A truly surreal historical moment. The single most powerful drug lord of modern times calmly admitting his horrific crimes in an open court. The judge firmly asks if he completely understands that this absolutely means spending the rest of his natural life in a concrete prison. El Mayo silently nods his heavy head. Yes. The legendary man who fiercely swore he would absolutely never see the inside of a jail cell will now know absolutely nothing else. Joaquin Guzman Lopez secured a completely different fate. By December 2025, United States prosecutors officially present him with an incredibly generous plea bargain. In a busy Chicago courtroom, wearing an orange jumpsuit, Joaquin formally admits to violently kidnapping Ismael Zambada. He confidently traded his family loyalty for his personal liberty. But it is an incredibly hollow and tragic victory. He can absolutely never safely return to his home in Mexico without a definitive death wish. His own surviving brothers would violently execute him, along with El Mayo's surviving fiercely loyalists, and countless other families who violently lost loved ones in the ensuing brutal war. Joaquin Guzman Lopez will miserably live out his remaining days, completely looking over his shoulder. As a permanent traitor to his own blood and his former cartel, the absolute downfall of Ismael Zambada was definitely not a failure of his legendary cunning. His brilliant systems kept him completely safe for exactly half a century. His tragic downfall was the entirely unavoidable cost of simply being human. To properly build a massive empire, he absolutely needed loyalty. To effectively earn that loyalty, he desperately needed trust. And trust is the ultimate vulnerability. It was the one single crack in his thick armor that absolutely no amount of bribery, violence, or extreme paranoia could completely seal. He foolishly let one single person fully inside his paranoid guard. That was absolutely all it took. 50 years of total invincibility rapidly undone by one single polite phone call. The brilliant man, who expertly anticipated every single deadly trap, violently fell into the only one he absolutely never saw coming. If you want to see another incredible story about a massive criminal syndicate who thought they were completely untouchable until one tiny mistake brought everything violently crashing down, check out our upcoming video on the legendary Lazarus Group. Make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to Your Channel Name for more deep dives into the criminal underworld.